important for us to think when we're discussing transportation equity. So Naomi, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I just want to give you some appreciation for all the support you provided and to the team, and also to the Safe Streets Summit, who have invited me to participate both in the earlier session and also to have this intimate conversation with you all today. So the question or conversation really we're going to talk about is transportation equity. And I loved how you put this yesterday, Areli, this compendium of access, right, equity, and then justice. And I'm really going to be talking about some of the work that I've had the privilege of doing alongside other colleagues that is in the justice end of the work. A lot of my work is also in transportation equity. And so I'll talk about those in just a moment, but really looking forward to our conversation. A little, just very briefly, so I have a couple hats. The first is that I am a principal and the director of equity, diversity, and inclusion at Nelson Nygaard, which is a firm that works in transportation planning and consulting, and we have offices across the US, and our work is both national and international in scope. And my work is both internal and external. I help really build capacity of our planners and staff to think about equity in our internal processes as a firm, as well as to support clients. So it has an inside and an outside kind of aspect. And I do work also with clients on projects specifically, everything from, developing frameworks to developing policy, prioritization for budgeting, so on and so forth. So I do have a planning background, and it is the work that I am doing now is very much guided and influenced by the work that I have been doing for a number of years through a collaborative of folks, which I'll talk about. But the Untokening is a multiracial collective of leaders working in communities at various levels on mobility justice, so advancing mobility justice and developing strategies wherever they sit in the community, whether it's as an artist, whether it's as an academic, whether it's as a planner, or whether it's as a council person. So we believe that mobility justice needs to be moved on all fronts. And so we have a pretty broad tent and a variety of people contributing, but we are a majority Black, Indigenous, people of color collaborative that work together. And we together shaped what has become the principles of mobility justice, which I'll talk about shortly. And this work influences all that I do. So whether I'm working at my former job, which was the Seattle Department of Transportation, leading the Transportation Equity Program, or to my work now as Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the firm, it is all guided by these principles. And essentially what I am doing is taking the principles and applying them in practical project-based ways, whether internally at organizations like my own, supporting clients like agencies, or working in and with community advocates. So I've already talked a little bit about like what the Untokening is. I guess the important thing here, and I'll just reiterate that it's a multiracial collective, and it centers, right, like the collective centers the lived experiences of those of us who lived marginalized and oppressed experiences and live in communities that have been politically marginalized as well. And we advance mobility, justice, and equity. Some of my collaborators because the Untokening is not one person. Like I said, it's collaborative, but we have an interesting structure where we have national co-facilitators and co-founders, and then we also have local collaborators, and I'll talk about the role of the local collaborators in a moment. But those of us who are on the national collaborating core organizing team, it's myself, Dr. Adonia Lugo, myself in Oakland, I should say, Dr. Adonia Lugo, who's based out of Los Angeles, Grace Kwong, who is in St. Louis, Missouri. We have Carolyn Shapansky, who is based out of the St. Paul, Minneapolis region. And then we also have Linda Lopez, who's in Chicago, Renee Rivera, who is in Oakland. We have Anthony Taylor, who is also in St. Paul, Minneapolis, and then Zahra Alabanza, who is based out of Atlanta, and also now she's in Mexico. This is our national collaborating group. And we all met through our advocacy work. We all spent time, or some of us, some folks are still squarely in the advocacy space, but we were all in the bicycle and pedestrian advocacy space. And this was, wow, 6 or 7 years ago at this point, having conversations about race as it related to a lot of the advocacy work that we were doing. I was the executive director of a bicycle advocacy organization in New Orleans at the time. I went on to work at the Alliance for Biking and Walking, which is based out of DC, but I was supporting a lot of advocacy organizations across the country, doing a lot of like organizing, really helping them to do power mapping and really the basics of organizing so that they could move campaigns and get funding and all those things. And then Carolyn Shapansky was working at the League of American Bicyclists and was their communications director. So we were all coming from advocacy, and what we were realizing was that we were having all of these conversations around, campaigns and digital organizing and strategizing and communications, and organizational development and staff and resources, and there was no conversation that was really talking about the intersection of race and gender and class and age and ability as it pertained to how people were getting around, so the modes of transportation, and how these different experiences really led to a different experience of feeling secure or insecure and social attitudes around that. And we thought that felt really strange. And it felt strange to us because we couldn't not think about those things, because we were coming to the space with identities that were not the sort of normative. And so we thought that that was a really important thing. We also felt that when we would bring these questions up as a way of talking about how to design our futures and how to potentially guide spending, and we were being met with this notion, or really being told that we were distracting from the real issues, and that just didn't quite settle with us. We felt like, no, these are real issues, and they're very real experiences, and they need to be centered. So we were tired of having to fight that fight and feeling erased. We were tired of feeling as if what we were bringing to the table wasn't of value, because what we saw was that ultimately, like, decisions in terms of advocacy and campaigns and ultimately where resources were going, it was creating winners and it was creating losers. And on the losing side, we were really seeing at like a national level that race, right, and class had a lot to do with that. And so we decided, rather than have these conversations at the margins, or rather than have these conversations in the hallways, or hope that, you know, attention would be paid to them, that we would simply create our own space, that we would form our own space, and that we would convene folks, and whoever came, and then we would talk about these issues, and we would not have a panel about it, but we would have an entire convening that was just really centering the experiences. And that really we would focus on healing and sharing these experiences, because there is this internal burden that people of color who are doing this work do bear the brunt of, and the emotional labor, frankly. And so we wanted to really pay attention to that and heal. And then from that, right, healing, foster not just space, but the ability for people to form like relationships, to feel valued, and then to be able to share like what they saw as critical, and where were these intersections coming to a real head, and then what were the strategies. And so that was what we set out to do. We had that very first convening in Atlanta in 2016. I believe it was after the Policy Link conference. We shouldered it on that. It was actually just after the election. So as you can imagine, people were feeling all kinds of ways. And so in Atlanta, we began our conversation, which has continued. But we've had several convenings since. We had Atlanta first, then we had Los Angeles, Detroit, and then the most recent one was in Durham, North Carolina. We did not have one in 2020. It wasn't planned, but we were planning to take that year to really do a reflective exercise on what we thought was the next sort of phase or iteration of our work. But then the pandemic hit, so it kind of ended up being necessary to do anyway. The other work that we do, which came out of the first convening, was, you know, there was a desire to keep that conversation going, to keep the healing and the relationship building and the strategies that we were starting to develop going. And so we really leaned into digital organizing again before the pandemic, just putting together webinars, putting together what we call transformative talks amongst different organizers across the country, different leaders, and having topical conversations. And all of these resources are available on our resource page, which I believe a link will be shared to that. But these are some of the things that we've produced in partnership, I should say, with Pueblo Planning and Mobility, People for Mobility Justice, and others. We've also we've created resources, documentation of our thinking and our process, and some of these thought leadership pieces are also on our website, including the principles of mobility justice, which we did a refresh on for COVID-19. And so there is sort of a amended COVID-19 pandemic principles of mobility justice. So I'm going to walk through some of the principles quickly, and then we'll get into our conversation, because really this is your time to sit with these thoughts and to ponder some of it in your work. But so the Untokening principles of mobility justice, like I said, it came out of the first convening, and really the focus of that convening was to start to identify like what we saw as some of the issues, right, in our current paradigm, and starting to really shine a light on what the range of barriers were to mobility, and what mobility even more fully meant, that have been existing in our communities. So that was the first thing that we set out to do. And then from that, once we had a very, very long list of these problems, the core organizers and the principal author of the Untokening, Dr. Doerner Lugo, we took, I guess it was the next several months to really say, okay, these are the problems. And so now what is the flip of that? Like, what is the sort of new vision for a new paradigm, right? That would lay out a way to actually pursue mobility justice and what it meant. And then practice, right? Like, so it's really important that the principles themselves, they're coming out of existing practices already. And then they're also meant to be practiced. So I say all that because some people want to just use the Untokening principles, but it was a process for us to get to delivering the principles. And I think that's the biggest thing I'd like to share, you know, is that like mobility justice is about process and it is about ensuring that communities are centered in the solutions. And so these principles aren't meant to be, you know, simply used, they're meant to be practiced and applied. So I think I'll start here, really in terms of mobility justice, right? Like, which is, I'll just say mobility justice as we've come to define it is really about self-determination and the freedom, right? For people, specifically people of color who have been politically marginalized and disenfranchised, to ultimately have the agency to decide how they want to move, where they want to go, the way they want to go, and to be free of persecution, right? To be free of harassment. And so to get there, we have to start at the beginning. We have to really surface the history of how we got to that place. So we need to excavate that information in our communities. We need to acknowledge it, like recognize that these things are true, they've happened. This history has been violent. And we need to reconcile, and reconciliation is about acknowledging and is about having honest conversations. And so in this way, like starting here is how we can actually begin to address the historical and current injustices. And that is, to me, like really key for the institutional and structural inequities that exist. We have to acknowledge that where they are and why they are and who they're impacting. The other thing that mobility justice is, right, is it is people over profit. It is people over property and placemaking, and it is prioritizing the lived experience of communities and the aspirations, right, the futures that they hope to have as the primary driver of change. And so Dr. Doerner Lugo, she talks a lot about human infrastructure. So mobility justice is about building human infrastructure and valuing that and enhancing that over the physical infrastructure and the aesthetics and the design of a place. Although that's important, but it's the human infrastructure that really needs to be invested in. We also, you know, and this is work that we're actually moving and leaning further into, abolition work, which is, you know, the removal and eradication of police enforcement and policing in our work in street safety. And so, again, if we understand the history of policing, and we understand what it is rooted in, then we would understand that from a public health lens and from a public security lens, that it has no place in the determinants of public health as a solution. So we really do, we examine that relationship, and we as a collective reject law enforcement from our practices. We also integrate environmental justice, because environmental justice is economic justice, is racial justice, is mobility justice. We see all these intersections, and we know that it is important to center this as part of the work. And it is often, right, like environmental racism can lead to people being displaced, has led to people being harmed. And so we want to eliminate environmental racism. Oh. Okay, sorry, slide went a little haywire. Finally, you know, I think this is in all of our principles. These are the highlights, but again, we really think it's important to have a multiracial organizing lens, but we do have an anti-racism lens within that. But we believe that by bringing in this multiracial organizing, that it basically gives greater power and agencies to the community. And, you know, our work is really about acknowledging the distrust that's been bred. And we know that structural, like government and programs and policies have sought to break communities and groups apart by dividing and pitting. And so we really seek to mend and heal some of that as well across our collaborative. So we foster trust, and we seek to really create common language and vocabulary to talk about these issues. So I have my, well, the Untokening's contact info. You can also reach out to me. I didn't put it on the slide, but I'm sure that I can put it in the chat. With that, I am going to stop talking.
Thank you so much, Naomi. I will post the questions that you provided for the discussion on the chat for everybody.
I will also, for the benefit of folks, I guess I'll just say them really quickly before we go into the breakouts. So there's 3 questions that, you know, I would love for you to ponder in your breakouts, and then we'll come back after the breakouts, do popcorn share, and then any questions that you have as well. But the questions are, have you heard this term before, mobility justice? I think the second question, remind me how I ordered these.
Yeah, what have you ever heard about the term mobility justice before? What does it mean to you? And are you using this framing or this idea of mobility justice to see an application in your work, and maybe some examples if we have them?
Yeah, so it's just a conversation starter. Jump in wherever you want.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think maybe the confusion is I don't think we're gonna break into breakouts, but we will have the discussion, right, Naomi?
Oh yes, because that's right. This is on me. We do not have over 40 people. We had made a plan, everybody. So because we only have 11 folks here, I think we're just gonna have a cozy conversation. So perfect.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, maybe for the sake of, do you wanna leave a slide maybe for us to kind of keep as a frame of thought in the slides?
Yeah, sure. I could maybe leave this one.
Yeah, that one, that one is great because I feel it brings the intersectionality. Yeah, thank you. I think that'll be great. All right, so we have the questions on the chat. If anybody would like to jump in and share your thoughts, this is the time. Because if not, I'll start talking. Okay, so, well, I think personally, I had not heard the term mobility justice until now, but until I met you and read about the Untokening. But I work in the field of food justice, so it's really good to see, to me personally, working in the field of food justice, to see that there is such a parallel movement and framework in the transportation and mobility realm of things. It really, as I had mentioned before, I think for me it's really important to think of how we can move the needle forward from access, which is really important, right? Like there's communities that don't have access to things, so definitely looking at access is something that we need to start with, even if you don't want to, if you are not able to get to the full spectrum. But it has to continue to move. I feel like it cannot stay just in that, right? It's like even just the way that I do it in food access, right? We start with access because for some people, even just understanding that there is deliberate policies and systems that make accessibility differential across race, class, gender, age, etc. It's a chore, right? So getting people to do access is important. But then we got to move them to equity. We got to move them to equity and start thinking about, okay, now that we are here, now that we understand access, now how can we make it more equitable? How can we make sure that everybody gets what they need, right? So that's when we start having conversations about community engagement. That's when we start talking about outreach and making sure that community is involved, right? But then again, who is the community we're speaking about? And that's, I feel, when we get to move people and organizers and planners and community leaders to justice, right? Because once we start placing that question of who is the community we're speaking about in equity, let's go to justice, because justice will look at the community. Justice will see what the intersections are of age, race, gender, background and nationality, like all of those things that matter really a great deal for all of us and in our lived experiences. So for me, it really is not a static thing. It's a goal, right? We go from equity from access to equity to justice, and we have to start looking at things that way. I feel in mobility, the same way that we're starting to do it in some of the food access questions.
Mm. Yeah, thanks for sharing the parallel with the food access. I haven't food access and food justice. I haven't done as much, or I don't do work in that space, but I know, like I said, these are all issues that are interlinked because of the root causes from which they come. So anybody else out there?
Yeah, I can jump in. So I think mobility justice is a term that I had heard kind of like in passing before, but this is the first time I've really heard it laid out in detail. And something I really like about it is that I feel like in planning, we talk a lot about equity and looking at things through an equity lens. And like at some point it starts to sound kind of meaningless if you're not actually doing it. And also, it needs to be more than just a lens. And for some people, it's not a lens that you can take on and off because it's their lived experience. And so I like that focus on folks' lived experience and what you mentioned at the beginning about you can't just take these principles and, read about them. You actually need to put them into practice.
Awesome. Anyone else? And if I guess I'm curious what the work is that people who are on the call are doing, and I guess what the interest was to come to, because you had an interest, you came to the discussion. So I'm curious, what the work is that you all are doing.
Just a quick reminder to people, maybe you have to unmute yourself, and sometimes we forget to unmute ourselves. So if anybody would like to share and just needs to check on the unmute.
Also totally fine. It's been a long day. Maybe people are just talked out. But and yeah,
go ahead, Naomi.
I was just gonna say, I feel like I sympathize with end of the week Friday,
Yeah, no, I agree. I think there is a lot of opportunities. I think that a lot of people in this conference have shared a lot of great potential for moving the needle to more justice work, right? I think that questions that we asked about, like you're thinking about how do you apply it, right? When you bring up process, I think that rethinking our processes in the planning field, in the public health field, in the engineering field, really rethinking our processes is something that is not too difficult, and it's a good start. It's a really good start to go from equity that maybe is just a talking point into equity that's actionable, and then potentially into justice, right? So I think that really looking at process, looking at how we do things, why we do the things we do, and why do we follow the frameworks or parameters that have been set before for us. I think that's really good start. So I really commend you for bringing that up and having that be part of your of the Untokening, because I really do like and this came up in the earlier conversation, and it has come up in various conversations throughout the conference, where we discuss the juxtaposition sometimes of frameworks versus context, right? So we have, or models versus context. So we have a contextual realities and where we live and how we live and what people experience. And that often doesn't always fit with the models that we have. So by looking again, where do we start? Look at your process, right? So go back to the process, think about why you're doing things, why you're choosing models, and then go back to the context, like where are we, who are the people that live here, who are the people that are experiencing this mobility space, and then go back to the model, right? So it's like, by looking at the process, to me, I think you hit it right there. It's really a strong way of starting.
Yeah, I think one really, I guess, concrete example that I can offer is in my previous role, I worked at the Seattle Department of Transportation. It was the Transportation Equity Program Manager, and I came to that role with the title having been defined, and then and we have a lot, like Seattle has a lot of equity frameworks, analysis tools. There's been a lot of thought and rigor that has been put into sort of like, and so when I got to the Department of Transportation, there was a real focus on the work that I was doing to essentially reallocate resources that were voter approved for transportation access, right? And it was because we were making all these investments into the transit system, and essentially we didn't operate the transit system, but we were funding King County Metro, the service providers service. So we were like we're providing resources so they could like augment and provide more service. And as part of that, we were also like really invested and felt it was very important to create more access to that service by providing people with with like free or reduced cards, right, for the service. And that's really important, right? Like that is really important work. The community wanted that. And as we know, transportation cost is not the only barrier. And so while we were addressing that and putting resources into it, it was really important for us to understand the broader breadth of like what mobility needs community had, so that we didn't just pour resources into one thing, but we were actually able to address a host of other issues. And so we internally had to go through a process to really get clear on like what it was we were doing, which was really about low-income access to transportation. And if we wanted to grow to a transportation equity program, we were really going to have a much more comprehensive conversation and a much more comprehensive approach that involved and centered the experiences of communities that were experiencing the disproportionate impacts. And so the entire rest of my time there was really about developing a plan for and then recruiting and seeding a transportation equity work group that would help us to develop a transportation equity agenda for not just transit service, but our overall right delivery and services of goods and services and programs for the city. So that just kind of like walks you through, right, like going from access to getting to equity, and eventually, right, like continuing on to that latter portion, that justice piece.
Yeah, and I think, oh, go ahead, Kelsey.
Oh, I just had a question, though if anybody else has anything, please feel free to jump in. And my question, Naomi, was, have you faced any sort of resistance with this framework? And what would your advice be to communities who want to promote this but might anticipate some resistance from either citizens or elected officials or colleagues?
Yeah, I think the hardest bit, for sure, especially in the advocacy community, particularly in the bicycle advocacy community, with Vision Zero, right, being such a prominent and really important campaign, right, for road safety and really considering vulnerable users. Myself, Tamika, like a number of folks have had really concerted conversations with organizers from the different, sort of Vision Zero lead cities and leaders around the enforcement, right, piece. And I think that is met with a lot of resistance. And, I think over the course of this summer or past summer, we saw with the uprisings and then with calls in so many cities to really, defund or reduce the funding for police. I think we as a society really started to understand the connections in a way that the Mobility Justice Collaborative has been seeing them in terms of policing and our streets and communities of color. So I think that is starting, because it's starting to be better understood. There's a much greater willingness to have the conversation, but it's still very difficult. And recommendations I have for folks that are interested in, really seeing that particular part of the mobility justice framework through is to stay the course and to, continue to raise the issue and to, use the data. I mean, the data is there, right? And we love to use the data to make our case for transportation and investments. And I think, the data is there, so.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And we do have a few more minutes left. And I know that right now, the conversation is kind of actually more applicable in terms of the examples that you've provided and Kelsey's question. Is there anybody else that I think everybody in this breakout is working to the best of our abilities to reach equity, right? Because it's like we spoke earlier, we're talking about this kind of ladder from access to equity to justice, right? So it's a stepwise approach, I guess. And I know personally that we all are doing the best of our abilities to really be actionable in equity, because like Kelsey mentioned earlier, we sometimes say equity but don't do it. But I know as a fact that a lot of the people in this conference are actively doing it, right? Are there any particular examples that anybody else has in like how do you see equity lens's effectiveness so far? And do you see an option or a path towards moving more towards justice in our work here in South Florida?
Are you opening that up for others? Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, I wanted to just throw it out there for everybody. If we have a couple more minutes, so feel free to share. And if not, we'll leave it there so that we can think about it. Because I feel like that's what it is. And I'm just going to share this openly. Most of our breakout sessions right now, people are still processing. We're all still processing today's event, today's conferences, today's dialogues. And I know there's a lot of information. So if anybody is not necessarily actively participating, it's a good thing to just continue to take in so that we can digest and then make sure that we can do something with this. All right, so I am going to share one more link for everybody because I am the pest that will remind you of all the little housekeeping things today. Here we go. Just please, this is the last set of sessions. Thank you so much for joining us, for being here with us all the day today. I have a link on the chat for you to complete your session surveys and the overall evaluation for the Safe Street Summit 2021. And then back to you, Naomi, for your closing.
Yeah, I just, again, thank you all so much for joining and for sticking it in there. Like, I know it's probably been a very long 2 days. The thing that I'll say is for all of you who are doing this work, and I know how hard it is day in and day out. I guess the last thing I'll say is, you know, our ability to both be builders and bridges is such a huge skill set, and it is so needed, and it costs us a lot. I know that it emotionally has its own toll that isn't seen, and so I just want to say that I see you and I'm appreciative, and you know, look forward to crossing paths in this work, and feel free to reach out to myself, members of the Untokening, if you want to have, you know, more conversations. And we will be organizing convenings, and so we would invite all of you to kind of follow us and join in the journey.
Maybe you can do one in South Florida.
I love that idea.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, everybody. I hope you have a great rest of your evening and a wonderful weekend ahead. Hey, Safe Street Summit 2021, we did it.
It's a wrap. It's a wrap.